Winter 1944, and the forests of the Ardennes were buried under snow so deep it seemed like the earth itself was trying to hide from what was coming. The German army, using everything they had left, launched one final desperate push westward, and what unfolded became known as the Battle of the Bulge, a fight that would test every Allied commander to their absolute limits. Nobody saw it coming with this kind of force. The German offensive tore through the Allied front like paper, creating a massive gap that threatened everything they had fought for. Inside Allied headquarters at Versailles, you could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Men walked quickly through the hallways, clutching folders, not knowing if the news inside was going to save them or doom them. Every passing hour felt like another piece of ground slipping away. And right at the center of this chaos was a small Belgian town that most people had never heard of, a place called Bastogne. It was just a dot on the map, but suddenly it became the most important location in all of Europe. The Germans needed it desperately because it sat at a critical crossroads, and without it, their entire offensive would stall. They threw everything at it. Meanwhile, the 101st Airborne Division rushed into Bastogne without proper winter gear, running low on ammunition, barely any medical supplies, and within days they were completely surrounded. These men didn't complain, they didn't ask for sympathy, they just asked for one thing: relief. They could hold the town, but not forever. For General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, this was like watching a vice slowly tighten around his entire strategy. Reports flooded his desk, briefings came one after another, but one fact remained crystal clear in his mind. If Bastogne fell, the German breakthrough could widen, and if that happened, the entire Allied line might collapse like a house of cards. Eisenhower refused to panic because panic was a luxury he couldn't afford, but even he felt the crushing weight of what was at stake. His staff could sense it too, moving quietly, speaking in hushed tones, double-checking every number. That was the atmosphere on the morning everything changed. It was just after 9 in the morning when a courier burst into the main planning room, his breath coming out in clouds of steam from the freezing cold outside, his boots leaving wet tracks across the floor. He was holding a folded piece of paper, fresh from the communication center, and normally messages got filtered through layers of staff before reaching the top, but not this one. He walked straight to the long table where Eisenhower stood with his senior officers, surrounded by maps covered in colored pins and handwritten notes. The courier didn't say a word, he just extended the message. Eisenhower took it and read it once quickly, his eyes narrowing. Then he read it again, slower this time, absorbing every word. When he finally looked up, he didn't need to speak because everyone closest to him could see it in his face. Something had shifted. There was a release of tension, a spark of something they hadn't felt in days: triumph. The message was simple but powerful. Patton's Third Army had reached Bastogne. They had done it. For 3 days, the High Command had been tracking General Patton's absolutely insane maneuver, watching in disbelief as he pivoted an entire army, complete with divisions, tanks, artillery, and supply lines, turning them 90 degrees north in the middle of a brutal winter storm. When Eisenhower had asked Patton how long it would take to make such a move, Patton had boldly declared he could attack within 48 hours. Most of the men in that room thought he was bluffing, making promises he couldn't keep. Even Eisenhower wondered if Patton was pushing too hard, risking too much. Now they had their answer, and it was staring them right in the face. Eisenhower exhaled slowly, not quite relief but something close to it, and his staff watched him anxiously, some expecting him to shout with joy, others thinking he might slam his fist on the table in celebration. Instead, he placed the paper down gently and said in a calm, steady voice that carried across the room, "Gentlemen, Patton made it." Those simple words changed everything. The tension that had been crushing them for days didn't disappear completely, but it loosened its grip, replaced by something they had almost forgotten: hope. One intelligence officer whispered under his breath, afraid speaking too loud might somehow undo what had just happened. He really did it. Eisenhower turned to face his entire staff, and you could see the determination in his eyes as he pointed at the message and explained what this meant. The Germans had counted on splitting the Allied lines. They had bet everything on Bastogne falling. But Patton got there first, and that meant their entire timetable was broken. Once you break an army's timetable, once you disrupt their carefully planned schedule, the whole offensive starts to die. He spoke without theatrics, without raising his voice, because Eisenhower never needed dramatics to command authority. His power came from absolute clarity, from knowing exactly what needed to be said and saying it without wasting a single word. But every single man in that room understood the weight of what he was telling them. The German assault that had erupted like a violent storm and driven deep into Allied territory now had a crack in its armor, and Patton, for all his controversy and bravado, had delivered exactly when it mattered most. But Eisenhower wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He gestured toward the map and spoke firmly, making sure everyone understood that this wasn't time to celebrate. Bastogne was still under tremendous pressure. The 101st was still surrounded and fighting for survival. Patton's men had reached the edge, but the corridor they had carved out was thin and fragile, and it had to hold while they widened it. This wasn't the end of the battle. This was just the beginning of turning the tide. He paused, letting those words sink deep into everyone's minds, and the staff nodded because no one dared assume the job was finished. Outside the headquarters, snow continued falling, muting every sound, creating an eerie, quiet blanket over the world. Inside, however, the entire energy had transformed. A sense of renewed purpose replaced the heaviness that had been weighing them down. Officers moved with fresh urgency. Radio operators adjusted their equipment with new focus. Liaison teams prepared to update both British and American commanders across the front. The desperate defensive battle at Bastogne was transforming right before their eyes into an organized counteroffensive. One intelligence officer who was there later recalled that in those minutes after the message arrived, the room felt alive again, truly alive. Not just optimistic, but alive, and that difference mattered more than anything because optimism can be dangerous. It can make you careless, but being alive meant having momentum, and momentum meant the Allies were no longer just reacting to German moves. They were starting to push back with force. Eisenhower lifted the message once more, his voice quiet but carrying absolute conviction as he repeated, "Patton reached Bastogne first. Now let's make sure that effort wasn't in vain." The staff dispersed quickly, each man returning to his specific post, but the atmosphere had completely transformed. You could feel it in every room. News spread through the headquarters like electricity coursing through wires, lifting spirits even in areas where men rarely allowed themselves to smile. For the first time since the Bulge had exploded across the front, the Allies felt deep in their bones that the German advance was no longer unstoppable, that they could fight back and win. And at the absolute center of this shift stood one undeniable fact that nobody could argue with. Patton had kept his word when it mattered most. While Eisenhower's staff scattered to relay orders and critical updates across the front, he remained at the map table for several long minutes, studying the thick lines marking German armored divisions still pressing hard against Bastogne from multiple directions. The message confirming Patton's arrival was absolutely a victory, but not the kind that allowed any commander to relax even for a moment. If anything, Eisenhower understood that the fight was about to become even more intense because the Germans, caught completely off balance, weren't going to simply abandon the crossroads they had nearly destroyed themselves trying to capture. They would counterattack with everything they had left in their arsenal, throwing their remaining strength at that narrow corridor Patton had carved through snow-choked roads and constant ambushes, and Patton's men would have to hold it under relentless enemy fire. Standing alone for a brief moment, Eisenhower rubbed his forehead and let out a long breath, feeling the immense weight of command pressing down on his shoulders. Though hundreds of thousands of men were fighting across Europe, the responsibility for coordinating everything, for making the decisions that would determine victory or defeat, rested on just a handful of shoulders, and his were the broadest. He couldn't afford sentiment, couldn't let emotions cloud his judgment, because decisions had to be made without hesitation based on information that was often incomplete, contradictory, or arriving too late. Yet the news from Patton's spearhead had injected a surge of resolve throughout headquarters, spreading like wildfire, and it was his job now to turn that spark into sustained momentum that would carry them to victory. He stepped back into the main operations office, where several officers had gathered again, frantically updating field reports with the latest information. Eisenhower addressed them with renewed clarity and precision, ordering them to establish a full communication link with Middleton's command immediately, to inform them that Patton had successfully opened a corridor and that reinforcements would be moving through it, and that he needed confirmation of exact unit positions as soon as humanly possible. The officers nodded sharply, and the tone in the room had become noticeably sharper, more confident than it had been just an hour earlier. As they hurried to carry out his orders with renewed energy, Eisenhower added one more critical instruction, telling them to inform British command about the breakthrough because they would want to know the situation was finally stabilizing after days of uncertainty. Behind his composed demeanor, behind that calm exterior he always maintained, Eisenhower felt a deep sense of vindication washing over him. The Germans had counted on surprise, on catching the Allies completely off guard, on the fractured state of Allied lines, on poor weather that would keep Allied aircraft grounded and unable to provide support. But they had fundamentally underestimated two things: the incredible resilience of American divisions who refused to break, and Patton's almost supernatural speed. For days, some Allied commanders had whispered doubts in quiet conversations, asking each other if Patton could truly pivot an entire army that fast, if he could genuinely cut through 20 miles of German-held territory in the middle of winter conditions. Many believed he was bold to the point of being reckless, that he was making promises he couldn't possibly keep. But Eisenhower understood Patton better than most people did, understood that his audacity wasn't pure bravado or ego. It was a carefully crafted tool, an extension of his strategic mind that he wielded with precision. When other commanders hesitated and played it safe, Patton charged forward and pushed boundaries, and now that quality, that willingness to take calculated risks, had given the Allies the one thing they desperately needed above all else: initiative. The power to act rather than react, to dictate the terms of battle rather than simply responding to enemy moves.